I'm so glad you're able to join back with us for our study through the book of Habakkuk. It's not a very well-known minor prophet. It's a good one, though, when it comes to prayer and how we're supposed to call out to the Lord. So let's remember the beginning, the prayer that starts the book out, where Habakkuk is inquiring to God. He's really crying out to God and asking him why. And really, he makes almost a series of accusations against God. For instance, he says, why do you show me iniquity and you cause me to behold grievance? He asks God basically why judgment wasn't being poured out on Israel for all their disobedience. And then he says something that I really want us to remember in verse 4. He said, the wicked doth compass about the righteous. And that's going to be really important when we get to the final chapter of the book of Habakkuk. So please remember that part. He says, why do you allow the wicked to surround or to compass about the righteous? And God's going to answer him. And at the end of the book, we're going to see that kind of come full circle. And it's really, really encouraging. But right now, he's basically calling out to the Lord, asking why all these things were being allowed to happen, why God was not stepping in, and why God wasn't pouring out his judgment on the Jews. So as we hold on to that thought, the beginning prayer of the book of Habakkuk, now we're going to start getting into God's response. And last week we looked at how God starts out his response by talking about himself. And God says, he sends out this announcement. He says, behold ye among the heathen and regard and wonder marvelously. And we looked at those two words, wonder marvelously. It's the same word repeated twice. And he's saying, be astonished, for I will work a work in your days, which ye will not believe, though it be told you. And that's basically where we got last time, just to verse 5. So today, Lord willing, we're going to look at verses 5 all the way down to verse 11. So verses 5 through 11. And what I want us to do is to look at some of the Old Testament references that God brings up in the book of Habakkuk. It's really fascinating. Remember that Habakkuk's prayer is kind of a reference back to Deuteronomy chapter 28. He's saying, he's reminding God when God told the Israelites that if they departed from him and didn't keep his commandments, that God was going to pour out judgment on them. So that's kind of what Habakkuk brings up. And so now the Lord, he says in response, God says that judgment against Israel is coming. It's just a matter of time. So God is in a way assuring Habakkuk that his prayer request is valid and judgment is indeed coming. So God's, in a way, basically God is saying, just wait for it. It's coming. You notice in verse 5, God says, I will work a work in your days. That means God's reaction time was going to be quick. Habakkuk's prayer was going to be answered speedy. And God was going to give this answer really shortly. So God does answer our prayers. And even when sometimes we feel like something's been going on for a long time and we just haven't heard from God about it, or maybe we don't see God working, it's always good to remember that God is at work. And God, his timing is perfect. And so God reminds him, he says, I will work a work in your days. He says, Habakkuk, this is going to happen in your lifetime. I will bring judgment. So just wait for it. Just trust in my perfect timing. And just as Habakkuk prayed, according to Deuteronomy 28, God actually answers Habakkuk according to the same passage. And this is huge. Okay, so please don't miss this. There's a comparison between Habakkuk 1, verses 5 through 11, and Deuteronomy chapter 28. Now, the comparison is pretty in-depth, but I just want to mention a couple of things just to show you how the Lord is referring back to what he prophesied back in Deuteronomy. So Habakkuk 1, verse 5, where he says, basically drawing attention to himself, I want you to wonder marvelously. I want you to fear me because I will answer this prayer request. And he says, I'm going to do a work. Then we're going to compare that with Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 58. So Deuteronomy 28, 58, it says, if thou wilt not observe to do all the words of this law that are written in this book, that thou mayest fear this glorious and fearful name, the Lord thy God. And so it's almost a repeat of Deuteronomy 28, where God already told them. He said, the reason why I'm going to punish you for walking away from me, for your disobedience, is because of the glory of my own name. And God tells back in Deuteronomy that they are to fear him. And so the fear of the Lord is what verse 5 is all about. And that's what this punishment is rooted in, this fear of the Lord. But then verse 6, Habakkuk 1:6, God continues, for lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. And we can compare that to Deuteronomy 28, verse 52, where God already told them, and he, which is a nation that God raises up for judgment, says, and he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustest, throughout all thy land, and he shall besiege thee in all thy gates throughout all thy land, which the Lord thy God hath given thee. So he's paralleling what he already prophesied back in Deuteronomy. I'll go ahead and read Habakkuk 1:7-9, where God says, they are terrible and dreadful, their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves, their horses also are swifter than the leopards, and they are more fierce than the evening wolves. Listen to this description. And their horsemen shall spread themselves, and their horsemen shall come up from far, and they shall fly as the eagle that hasteneth to eat. They shall come all for violence, their faces shall sup up as the east wind, and they shall gather the captivity as the sand. Now compare that to Deuteronomy 28, verses 49-51, where the Lord says, and the Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as an eagle flieth. A nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. A nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. And he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle, the fruit of thy land, until thou be destroyed, which also shall not leave thee, either corn, wine, nor oil, or the increase of thy kine, or flocks of thy sheep, until he have destroyed thee. So God is saying, basically, he's saying to Habakkuk, yeah, you mentioned Deuteronomy chapter 28. Well, I wrote that, and I'm still holding true to my word. And you think, well, that sounds really, really bad. It is pretty bad, but it gets even worse. Habakkuk 1 verse 10 basically says that the most strong defenses that the Jews had would be about as useful as dust, and the enemy would just take them. And then verse 11 says that God knew ahead of time that they, which is the conquering nation, that they would attribute this conquest to their own pagan gods, Bel and Nebo. But God chose to use the Chaldeans anyways. So this sounds pretty bleak, pretty hopeless. And to be honest, Habakkuk wasn't very happy about the answer that God gave to his prayer. But God gave him an insight into his own plans and purposes. And the hopeful thing is that God always acts according to his word. When God makes a promise in the Old Testament, he keeps it. Even in this period, after the kings, when they're going into captivity, the time period that Habakkuk is written in, there's still hope because God is always faithful to his word. So the fact that God's going to keep the prophecy from Deuteronomy 28 tells us God will keep his word, even when the immediate outcome is not favorable. So next time we're going to jump into Habakkuk's response. He turns up the heat a little bit, but we'll see you then.